watched the young man approaching the church entrance with a backpack. His name is Fawad. He's about to desecrate holy books in front of shocked families. Then his arm freezes midair. Wind swirls around only him, forcing him to his knees in supernatural intervention.
My name is Fawad, and on January 17th, 2023, I committed an act of hatred that changed my life forever. I was 24 years old, filled with rage against Christianity. What happened next defied every belief I held sacred. I was born into a world where hatred was taught as devotion, where anger toward Christians was disguised as religious purity. Growing up in Birmingham's tight-knit Muslim community, I learned early that Christians were not just different from us, they were our enemies. The mosque leaders would speak with fire in their voices about how Christianity had corrupted the true message of God, how these people worshipped a false trinity instead of the one true Allah. Every Friday prayer, every religious gathering, every conversation at home reinforced this message until it became the very foundation of my identity. My father would sit me down after evening prayers and tell me stories about the Crusades, about how Christians had murdered innocent Muslims for centuries. He spoke of modern missionaries who came to Muslim lands not to help but to steal souls from Islam. These weren't just history lessons to him, they were personal wounds that he carried in his heart. When he looked at me with those intense brown eyes, I could see the pain of generations who had suffered at the hands of what he called Christian imperialism. The anger consumed me like fire in my chest, growing stronger with each passing year. When I walked through Birmingham's city center and saw churches with their crosses reaching toward heaven, I felt my stomach turn with disgust. When I heard church bells ringing on Sunday mornings, they sounded like war drums to my ears. The very sight of people carrying Bibles made my hands clench into fists. This wasn't just disagreement with their beliefs. This was visceral hatred that had been carefully cultivated and nurtured since my childhood. By the time I turned 20, I had convinced myself that attacking Christianity was not just acceptable, but my religious duty. I spent hours reading online forums where young Muslim men like myself shared stories of confronting Christians, of challenging their faith publicly, of making them feel unwelcome in what we considered Muslim neighborhoods. These digital echo chambers fed my rage and gave me a sense of righteous purpose. The local Anglican church on Maple Street became my obsession. I would walk past it every day on my way to work at the electronics shop, and each time I saw families entering for worship, I felt that familiar burning in my chest. There was something about their peaceful faces, their quiet contentment, that infuriated me even more than loud evangelical preaching would have. How dare they find peace in what I had been taught was a corrupted religion? How dare they smile and laugh and live normal lives while practicing what my community considered blasphemy? It was during one of these daily walks that I met Rashid, a fellow member of our mosque, who shared my intensity about defending Islam. Rashid was older than me, maybe 30, with a thick beard and eyes that burned with the same fire I felt in my own heart. He had been watching the church too, he told me, studying their patterns and growing increasingly frustrated with their presence in our neighborhood. We began meeting after Friday prayers, walking past the church together, and talking about what we saw as the Christian problem in Britain. Rashid had theories about how churches were secretly working to convert Muslim youth how they used charity work and community outreach as covers for missionary activity. He showed me websites that claimed to expose Christian plots against Islam, articles that painted every act of Christian kindness as manipulation. I convinced myself this was holy warfare, that every step I took toward confronting these Christians brought me closer to Allah. The Quran speaks of defending Islam against its enemies, and in my twisted understanding, I believe that included attacking the symbols of Christianity. Rashid agreed, encouraging my growing militancy with quotes from radical clerics and stories of Muslim heroes who had stood up to Christian oppression. Planning the attack on the church became my obsession for weeks. I studied their Sunday morning schedule, noting when families arrived, when services began, when the parking lot was fullest. I wanted maximum impact, maximum witnesses to see Islam triumph over Christianity. Rashid and I would sit in the cafe across the street, watching through the window as children ran up the church steps and elderly couples walked slowly arm in arm toward the entrance. The weight of hatred that drove me toward that fateful morning was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It consumed my thoughts during the day and invaded my dreams at night. I would wake up in cold sweats, my heart racing with anticipation of the moment when I would finally strike back against the religion that had supposedly oppressed my people for centuries. Ask yourself this question. Have you ever felt conviction so strong that it blinded you to basic human decency? That is where I lived for months, in a darkness so complete that I mistook evil for righteousness. I prayed 5 times a day, asking Allah to give me strength for what I planned to do. I fasted to purify my intentions. I read the Quran, searching for verses that would justify my actions. The books I planned to use came from the church's own donation box outside the building. They had a small wooden container where people could leave Bibles for anyone who wanted them, a gesture of openness that I saw as arrogance. How presumptuous of them to assume anyone would want their corrupted scriptures. I took several of these books home, handling them with disgust, preparing them for the public destruction that would send a clear message to every Christian in Birmingham. I told myself that spitting on their holy book would prove my devotion to Islam, that humiliating their faith publicly would somehow elevate my own. The twisted logic of hatred had completely taken over my rational mind, turning me into someone I barely recognized, someone capable of cruelty in the name of God. November 12th arrived with the kind of crisp autumn morning that should have filled me with peace, but instead my heart raced with dark anticipation. I had barely slept the night before, my mind consumed with rehearsing every detail of what I planned to do. The morning call to prayer at 5:30 found me already awake, staring at the ceiling and mentally preparing for what I believed would be my moment of religious triumph. I performed my morning ablutions with extra care that day, washing my hands and face 3 times as prescribed, believing that spiritual purity would somehow sanctify the hatred I was about to unleash. The irony was completely lost on me then, how I was preparing to commit an act of cruelty while seeking God's blessing. Such is the blindness that comes from hearts hardened by years of carefully cultivated anger. My mother was already in the kitchen preparing breakfast when I came downstairs, her hijab perfectly arranged as she moved quietly between the stove and counter. She looked up at me with those gentle brown eyes that had comforted me through childhood fevers and teenage heartbreaks, completely unaware that her son was about to become someone she would struggle to recognize. If I had known that this would be one of our last peaceful mornings together, would I have chosen differently? The question haunts me still. I told her I was meeting Rashid for community service at the mosque, a lie that came so easily it frightened me even then. She smiled and packed extra food in my lunch bag, telling me how proud she was that I was so devoted to helping our community. Her trust felt like a weight in my stomach, but I pushed the guilt away and focused on what I saw as my righteous mission. The walk to the church felt different that morning. Every step seemed to echo with finality, as if the universe itself knew that I was approaching a moment that would change everything. The familiar streets of my neighborhood looked somehow sharper, more vivid, like my senses were heightened by the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I could smell the November air more intensely, hear the distant sounds of morning traffic more clearly, feel the rough fabric of my jacket more acutely against my skin. Filling my backpack with the books I had taken from the church's donation box felt like loading ammunition for battle. I handled each one with disgust, these symbols of what I believed was corrupted faith, preparing them for their public destruction. The weight of them in my bag felt significant, like I was carrying the weight of centuries of conflict between our religions. I was 24 years old and completely convinced that I understood the complexities of history and faith well enough to justify what I was about to do. The backpack felt heavier with each step toward Maple Street. My hands trembled as I adjusted the straps, but not from fear, from anticipation. This trembling was like that of a hunter who has finally cornered his prey, the physical manifestation of excitement and nervous energy that comes before a long planned action. I kept checking my phone for the time, knowing that Sunday morning service began at 10 and wanting to arrive when the most people would witness my protest. As I rounded the corner onto the street where the church stood, I could see families beginning to arrive for worship. There was something deeply unsettling about seeing them up close. These people I had demonized in my mind for so long. They looked so ordinary, so peaceful, nothing like the aggressive missionaries and crusaders my father had described in his stories. But I pushed these observations away, reminding myself that appearances could be deceiving and that their calm demeanor was probably just a mask for their true intentions. Walking past these families as they made their way toward the church entrance felt like moving through enemy territory. I studied their faces, looking for signs of the corruption and evil I had been taught to expect, but instead I saw tired parents trying to manage restless children, elderly couples leaning on each other for support, teenagers reluctantly following their parents with the universal expression of adolescent boredom that transcends all cultural boundaries. The peaceful faces of one particular elderly couple struck me with unexpected force. They were probably in their 70s, walking slowly, hand in hand, toward the church steps. The man had silver hair and wore a worn but well-maintained suit, while the woman beside him had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and moved with the careful grace of someone whose body has been softened by age, but whose spirit remains strong. They were talking quietly to each other, occasionally smiling at something one of them said, completely absorbed in their private conversation. Seeing them should have humanized the people I was about to attack, but instead it made me angrier. How dare they look so content, so at peace with themselves and their faith? How dare they find joy in what I had been taught was a religion of oppression and lies? The happiness felt like a personal insult to everything I believed, a challenge to the narrative that had shaped my entire worldview. A young mother pushing her child in a stroller paused near me as I stood on the sidewalk, pretending to check my phone. The little boy, maybe 3 years old, was bundling up in a small winter coat and kept trying to escape from his stroller straps to run ahead toward the church playground. His mother, probably in her early 30s, with tired but patient eyes, kept gently redirecting his attention and speaking to him in soft, loving tones about being patient until after church when he could play. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself, what kind of person sees a mother tenderly caring for her child and feels anger instead of recognition of shared humanity? That was who I had become. Someone so consumed by ideological hatred that I could witness basic human love and kindness and interpret it as somehow threatening to my beliefs. The mother and child represented everything innocent and pure about human connection, yet I saw them only as representatives of a faith I had been taught to despise. The weight of my backpack seemed to increase as more families arrived, each one forcing me to confront the reality that these were not the cartoon villains my hatred had created in my mind. They were human beings living ordinary lives, seeking meaning and community and spiritual connection, just as people in my own mosque did every Friday. But acknowledging their humanity would have required admitting that my years of anger might have been misdirected, and I was not ready for that kind of self-examination. Standing there on that November morning, surrounded by families making their way to worship, I felt a moment of hesitation that I quickly pushed away. The doubt lasted only seconds, but in those seconds, I felt something trying to break through the armor of hatred I had built around my heart. Some deeper part of me, perhaps the part that still remembered my mother's gentle teachings about compassion, tried to surface and stop what I was about to do. But I had invested too much in this moment, spent too many weeks planning and preparing and building up my courage to turn back now. The books in my backpack felt like a commitment I could not abandon, a promise I had made to my understanding of faith and duty that demanded fulfillment. I checked the time on my phone again and began walking toward the church entrance, my heart pounding with the knowledge that in just a few minutes, everything would change forever. The moment I pulled the first book from my backpack, time seemed to slow to an agonizing crawl. My hands were steady now, all the trembling replaced by a cold determination that felt like ice water flowing through my veins. The book felt heavier than it should have, its leather cover worn smooth by countless hands that had held it in prayer and study. For just an instant, I wondered about those hands, about the people who had found comfort in these pages, but I crushed that thought immediately and focused on my mission. Throwing the first book onto the stone pathway felt like crossing a line I could never uncross. The sound it made hitting the ground was louder than I expected, a sharp crack that seemed to echo off the church walls and announce my intentions to everyone within hearing distance. The book landed face down, its pages splaying open in a way that looked almost like broken wings, and I felt a surge of satisfaction that surprised me with its intensity. I felt powerful in that moment, like I was defending my faith against centuries of oppression. The adrenaline coursing through my system made every sensation more vivid, every sound more crisp, every movement more deliberate. This was what righteous anger felt like, I told myself. This burning sense of purpose that made me feel connected to something larger than my individual existence. I was not just Fawad acting alone. I was a warrior for Islam, a defender of the true faith, striking back at its enemies, spitting on the sacred pages as families watched in horror felt like the most natural thing in the world. The saliva hit the open pages with a wet splat that seemed to reverberate in the sudden silence that had fallen over the churchyard. I could hear my own breathing, heavy and rapid, and the sound of my heart beating so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. The act felt ceremonial, ritualistic, like I was performing some ancient rite of conquest and dominance. The gasps and cries from the churchgoers should have given me pause, should have reminded me of my own humanity, but instead they fed my sense of triumph. These sounds of shock and distress felt like evidence that my message was being received, that I was successfully challenging their comfortable assumptions about religious tolerance and peaceful coexistence. The elderly couple I had noticed earlier stood frozen on the pathway, their hands still clasped together, but their faces now pale with shock and confusion. The young mother with the stroller had stopped walking and was staring at me with an expression I had never seen before, something that combined fear and sadness and a kind of bewildered hurt that made her look much older than her years. Her little boy had stopped trying to escape his straps and was looking back and forth between his mother's face and the scene I was creating, sensing that something terrible was happening, but unable to understand what or why. Other families had gathered in small clusters near the church entrance, some pulling their children closer, others reaching for their phones to call for help. A few of the men took steps in my direction, as if they might try to stop me, but something in my posture or expression warned them away. I must have looked dangerous in that moment, consumed as I was by years of accumulated anger, finally finding its outlet in public destruction. The pastor emerging from the church doors marked the moment when this confrontation became personal rather than symbolic. He was a man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of calm, steady presence that comes from years of providing comfort during times of crisis. His clerical collar caught the morning sunlight as he walked slowly down the church steps, his hands visible and empty, his pace deliberate and non-threatening. What struck me most about his approach was the complete absence of anger in his demeanor. I had expected rage, demands that I stop, threats to call the police, anything that would justify the confrontation I was seeking. Instead, he moved with the careful grace of someone approaching a wounded animal, someone more concerned with preventing further damage than with asserting authority or defending territory. His face showed something I was not prepared for and did not know how to interpret. It was not fear, though he surely recognized that I posed some kind of threat. It was not disgust, though what I was doing was deeply offensive to everything he believed. What I saw in his eyes as he drew closer was something that made my stomach clench with unexpected discomfort. It looked almost like compassion, like he was looking at me and seeing not an enemy to be defeated, but a person in pain who needed help. This was not the script I had written in my mind for this encounter. The pastor was supposed to be angry, defensive, maybe even aggressive in response to my attack on his faith. His calmness was throwing off my entire understanding of how this confrontation was supposed to unfold. I found myself hesitating for the first time since I had begun my assault on their sacred text, unsure how to respond to kindness when I had prepared only for conflict. The book lay on the stone pathway between us, its pages still wet with my saliva, a physical representation of the hatred I had brought to this place. But somehow, in the space of those few moments, the presence of this calm pastor had changed the entire dynamic of the situation. Instead of feeling triumphant about my successful attack on Christianity, I felt suddenly exposed and uncertain, like I was a child caught doing something wrong by an adult whose disappointment hurt more than punishment would have. Reaching for the second book in my backpack should have been the natural continuation of what I had started, the escalation that would drive home my message and complete my mission. My hand moved automatically toward the zipper, my fingers finding the familiar weight of another book that I had prepared for this moment. This was supposed to be the climax of my protest, the moment when I proved beyond any doubt that I was willing to go as far as necessary to defend my faith. But as my hand closed around the second book and I began to lift it from my backpack, something fundamental shifted in the very fabric of reality around me. What happened next still gives me chills when I think about it. Still makes my hand shake when I try to describe the moment when everything I knew about God and faith and the nature of existence was turned completely upside down. The world around me seemed to hold its breath, as if creation itself was waiting to see what choice I would make in that crucial moment. The pastor continued his slow approach, his eyes never leaving mine, his expression remaining calm and patient and infused with that inexplicable compassion that I could not understand or categorize. Behind him, the families watched in silence, their shock giving way to something that looked almost like prayer. I lifted the second book from my backpack with the same determination I had shown with the first, ready to continue my assault on their faith and drive home the message that Islam would not be passive in the face of what I saw as Christian aggression. But as I raised my arm to throw the book down beside the first one, something happened that defied every law of physics and theology and common sense that I thought governed the world. My right arm froze completely mid-reach, suspended in the air like it had been turned to stone. I cannot adequately describe the terror of losing control of your own body in such a sudden and complete way. One moment my arm was moving naturally towards the ground, where I planned to throw the second book, and the next moment it was locked in position as if some invisible force had wrapped iron bands around my shoulder, elbow, and wrist. I couldn't move it no matter how hard I strained, couldn't even twitch my fingers or rotate my wrist. The muscles in my arm began to burn with the effort of trying to break free from whatever was holding me. But nothing happened. It was like trying to move a mountain with my bare hands, an exercise in absolute futility that left me gasping with exertion and growing panic. The book remained clutched in my frozen fingers, suspended above my head like some bizarre statue commemorating my own hatred. The sensation was unlike anything I had ever experienced or could have imagined. It was not like muscle cramps or injuries I had suffered before, not like the temporary paralysis that sometimes comes with sleeping in an awkward position. This was complete and absolute, as if my arm had been severed from my nervous system while remaining physically attached to my body. I could see it there above my head, could feel the weight of the book in my hand, but I could not command it to move even an inch in any direction. Wind began swirling violently around only my body, a localized phenomenon that defied every law of meteorology I had ever learned. The air around me moved with the fury of a tornado, picking up leaves and papers and small debris from the church grounds and spinning them in tight circles that encompassed perhaps 10 feet in diameter. Yet beyond that invisible boundary, the air remained perfectly still, as calm and peaceful as it had been when I first arrived that morning. Papers and leaves danced in a perfect circle around me, caught in currents of air that seemed to obey their own mysterious physics. I watched in growing terror as a child's drawing that had been posted on the church bulletin board was lifted by the wind and began orbiting my frozen form like a satellite. Autumn leaves that should have fallen straight to the ground instead rose and twisted and spun around my body in patterns that looked almost choreographed. Everyone else's clothes remained perfectly still, hanging naturally on their bodies, as if they stood in a vacuum-sealed room. The pastor's clerical robes did not flutter. The young mother's hair did not move. The elderly couple's jackets hung straight and undisturbed. The contrast was so stark, so impossible, that I began to wonder if I was having some kind of psychotic break, if the stress of the moment had finally caused my mind to snap completely. But the physical sensations were too real, too intense to be hallucination. I could feel every gust of wind against my face and body, could taste the dust and debris being lifted from the ground, could hear the roaring sound that the swirling air made as it moved around me in its impossible pattern. My eyes watered from the force of the wind, and my clothes whipped against my body with enough force to leave bruises that I would discover later. The temperature dropped dramatically around my frozen form, creating a pocket of Arctic air in the middle of what had been a mild November morning. My breath began coming out in visible puffs of vapor, as if I had been transported to the middle of winter while everyone else remained in autumn. The cold was not gradual or subtle, but immediate and shocking, like stepping into a walk-in freezer without warning. I could see my breath forming small clouds in front of my face, while the pastor, now only a few feet away, showed no signs of feeling any change in temperature at all. His breath remained invisible, his posture relaxed and comfortable, as if he were enjoying a pleasant morning stroll, rather than witnessing what should have been a terrifying supernatural event. The combination of the paralyzed arm, the localized windstorm, and the dramatic temperature drop created a sensory overload that pushed me beyond rational thought into pure animal panic. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, to escape whatever force was manipulating the natural world around me, but my legs began to feel weak and unsteady beneath the weight of what I was experiencing. Ask yourself this question: when have you felt the presence of something so far beyond your understanding that it reduced you to the level of a frightened child? That was where I found myself in that moment, stripped of all my adult confidence and religious certainty, confronted with evidence that the universe operated according to laws I had never even imagined. My legs gave out beneath me without warning, dropping me to my knees on the cold stone pathway with enough force to send shock waves of pain through my entire body. The impact jarred my teeth together and scraped my knees through my jeans, but the physical pain felt distant and unimportant compared to the overwhelming presence of whatever force had taken control of my immediate environment. Kneeling there on the stone with my arms still frozen above my head and the wind still roaring around my body, I felt smaller and more helpless than I had since early childhood. The hatred that had sustained me through months of planning and preparation simply evaporated, replaced by a terror so complete that it seemed to hollow out my chest and leave me gasping for air. The book was still clutched in my paralyzed fingers, but it no longer felt like a weapon or symbol of my religious devotion. Instead, it felt like evidence of my own foolishness, proof that I had fundamentally misunderstood something crucial about the nature of faith and divine power. I had come here believing that I was acting on behalf of God, but the supernatural forces now surrounding me suggested that I might have been catastrophically wrong about whose side I was really on. The pastor continued his approach, despite the chaos swirling around me, his calm demeanor unchanged by the impossible things he was witnessing. He moved through the edge of the windstorm as if it were nothing more than a gentle breeze, his robes barely stirring as he drew close enough for me to see the details of his weathered face and kind eyes. When he was close enough that I could have reached out and touched him if my arm had been free to move, he stopped and looked down at me with an expression that completed my psychological destruction. There was no triumph in his face, no satisfaction at seeing his attacker brought low by supernatural intervention. Instead, there was only a deep sadness mixed with something that looked unmistakably like love. The wind began to calm as we looked at each other, the papers and leaves settling slowly to the ground around my kneeling form. The temperature remained cold, my breath still visible in the air, but the roaring sound faded until the churchyard was filled with an almost supernatural quiet. In that silence, with my arms still frozen above my head and my knees aching against the stone, I heard the pastor speak the words that would change the entire trajectory of my life. Tears began streaming uncontrollably down my face before I even understood why I was crying. They came without warning, hot against my cold cheeks, flowing in steady streams that I could not stop or slow, despite my desperate attempt to maintain some dignity in this impossible situation. These were not tears of frustration or anger or even fear, though all those emotions were certainly present. These tears seemed to come from somewhere deeper, from a part of my soul that had been locked away for so long I had forgotten it existed. The crying was violent and overwhelming, the kind of weeping that shakes your entire body and leaves you gasping for breath between sobs. I had not cried like this since I was a small child, had trained myself through years of masculine conditioning to suppress such displays of emotion. But whatever force had paralyzed my arm and summoned the wind had also stripped away my ability to control my emotional responses, leaving me as vulnerable and open as a newborn infant. Through my tears, I could see the pastor's face more clearly as he approached, and what I saw there completed the demolition of every assumption I had brought to this confrontation. His eyes held no trace of anger or vindication, no satisfaction at seeing his attacker brought low by divine intervention. Instead, there was a profound sadness mixed with something that I could only describe as pure love, the kind of unconditional acceptance that I had only glimpsed in my mother's eyes during my earliest childhood. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone approaching a wounded animal, his hands visible and empty, his posture non-threatening despite the chaos I had brought to his church grounds. Each step he took seemed measured and intentional, as if he understood that sudden movements might shatter whatever fragile moment was unfolding between us. The contrast between his calm presence and my emotional breakdown was so stark that it felt like we existed in different universes. When he spoke, his voice carried across the supernatural quiet that had settled over the churchyard, like a gentle breeze carrying the scent of spring flowers. The words themselves were simple, almost mundane, but they hit me with the force of a physical blow that somehow managed to heal, even as it wounded. His accent carried the soft cadences of someone who had spent decades comforting people in the darkest moments. "Son," he said, and in that single word, I heard more acceptance than I had experienced in years of seeking approval from my family and community. "He's calling you home." The pronoun carried unmistakable weight, referring to someone whose identity needed no explanation in that moment. I knew immediately who he meant, and the knowledge terrified me more than the supernatural events I had just experienced. The paralysis released the moment I whispered Jesus through my tears, like a key turning in a lock that had been sealed for 24 years. The sensation of control returning to my arm was as sudden and dramatic as its loss had been, accompanied by a tingling rush of sensation that felt like electricity flowing back through dead circuits. The book fell from my suddenly nerveless fingers, landing beside the first one I had desecrated on the stone pathway. But regaining physical control of my body did nothing to stop the emotional avalanche that continued to overwhelm me. If anything, being able to move again made the crying worse, as if the return of my physical agency had opened floodgates that had been sealed by more than just supernatural paralysis. I found myself sobbing so hard that I could barely breathe, gasping and choking on my own tears as wave after wave of emotion crashed over me. The name I had whispered felt foreign on my tongue, like speaking a language I had never learned but somehow understood perfectly. 24 years of Islamic conditioning had taught me to view that name as blasphemy, as the central figure in a corrupted religion that had led billions astray from the true path to God. But in that moment, with tears streaming down my face and my body shaking with supernatural encounter, the name felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering in exile. Collapsing completely was not a choice, but an inevitability, as if every support structure that had held up my sense of identity and purpose had been simultaneously removed. I went from kneeling to lying curled on my side on the cold stone, my face pressed against the scattered pages of the books I had destroyed, my body racked with sobs that seemed to echo off the church walls and return to me amplified. Sobbing into the scattered pages felt like the ultimate irony, my tears falling on the very words I had come to destroy, mixing my salt water with the saliva I had used to defile them. The pages felt soft against my cheek, worn smooth by countless hands that had turned them in search of comfort and wisdom. Even damaged and disrespected as they were, they still carried a sense of peace that I could not understand or explain. The congregation began gathering around me in those moments of my complete breakdown, but not in the way I would have expected. I had anticipated anger, demands for my arrest, calls for justice against someone who had attacked their faith so publicly and viciously. Instead, I heard the soft shuffle of feet on stone as people drew closer, voices murmuring words I could not quite make out, but whose tone conveyed something entirely different from the hostility I deserved. The gathering was not in anger, but in prayer. A circle of people who had witnessed something impossible and chosen to respond with compassion rather than condemnation. I could hear them around me, their voices joining together in quiet supplications that created a canopy of sound above my broken form. Some spoke in English, others in languages I did not recognize, but all carried the unmistakable cadence of people addressing the divine on behalf of someone in desperate need. An elderly woman helped me to my feet with hands that shook with age but held surprising strength. I recognized her as half of the couple I had seen, walking hand in hand toward the church earlier, before my world had been turned upside down by supernatural intervention. Her wire-rimmed glasses had slipped down her nose, and she pushed them back up with one finger, while keeping her other hand firmly on my arm to steady me. Her touch was gentle but insistent, the kind of physical care that communicates safety and acceptance without need for words. She guided me slowly to a standing position, supporting my weight as my legs struggled to remember how to hold me upright. The kindness in her aged face was almost too much to bear, especially knowing that she had witnessed my attack on everything she held sacred. Being invited inside the church despite what I had done felt like being welcomed into heaven despite a lifetime of sin. The pastor gestured toward the open doors with the same calm grace he had shown throughout this entire impossible encounter, his invitation carrying no trace of reluctance or conditional acceptance. He was offering me sanctuary in the very place I had come to attack, extending forgiveness before I had even asked for it. The walk from the churchyard to the entrance felt like crossing between two different worlds, leaving behind the person I had been for 24 years and stepping into something entirely unknown. Each step toward those open doors required conscious effort, as if I were walking against the current of my own conditioning and cultural programming. But the gentle pressure of the elderly woman's hand on my arm kept me moving forward, one foot in front of the other, toward whatever waited for me inside. This is what true forgiveness looks like, I realized, as we approached the threshold. Not the grudging acceptance that comes after long negotiation and proven repentance, but immediate and unconditional welcome extended to someone who has just committed an unforgivable act. The contrast between what I deserved and what I was receiving was so stark that it left me struggling to process the reality of what was happening. The baptism ceremony, 2 months later, took place in the same church where I had committed my act of hatred, a poetic justice that was not lost on anyone present that February morning. Standing in the baptismal pool, wearing simple white robes, I could see through the windows to the exact spot where my arm had been frozen in supernatural paralysis, where my tears had first fallen on the pages I had tried to destroy. The water was warm against my legs, but I shivered anyway, not from cold, but from the magnitude of what was about to happen. Pastor Williams, the same man who had approached me with such impossible compassion on that November morning, stood beside me in the water with his hands gentle but firm on my shoulders. His voice carried the same calm authority it had possessed during our first encounter, but now I heard it differently, filtered through months of studying scripture and learning to recognize the sound of divine love speaking through human vessels. The congregation that gathered to witness my baptism included many of the same faces that had seen my attack on their faith. The elderly woman who had helped me to my feet was there in the front row, her husband beside her with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. The young mother, whose child I had frightened with my violence, sat near the back, her little boy now old enough to understand that something important was happening, even if he could not grasp its full significance. As Pastor Williams lowered me beneath the surface of the baptismal water, I felt the symbolic weight of my old life being washed away, of the hatred and anger that had defined me for so long being dissolved and carried away by the current of grace. The moment underwater felt eternal, a suspended space between who I had been and who I was becoming, between the religion of my birth and the faith of my choice. Family disowning me. The day I confessed my conversion remains the most painful memory of this entire journey, more difficult even than the supernatural encounter that had shattered my worldview. I will never forget the look on my father's face when I told him about my baptism, the way his features collapsed from confusion to disbelief to a kind of grief that made him look like he was mourning my death rather than my spiritual rebirth. My mother's tears were harder to bear than my father's anger. The quiet sobs as she realized that her son had not just changed religions, but had embraced the faith she had been taught to view as Christianity's corruption of God's true message. She sat at our kitchen table with her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking with the kind of crying that comes from the deepest places of the heart, while my father paced behind her like a caged animal. The conversation lasted less than an hour, but it severed relationships that had taken 24 years to build. By the time I left the house that evening, carrying a single suitcase with my most essential belongings, I was no longer their son in any way that mattered to them. The door that closed behind me that night has never opened again, despite my letters and phone calls and attempts to bridge the gap that my conversion created between us. Death threats from former mosque members began arriving within days of news spreading through Birmingham's Muslim community about my baptism. The messages came through social media, written on paper and slipped under my door, whispered by acquaintances who had once been friends. Some were specific and detailed, describing exactly what would happen to me if I continued down this path of apostasy. Others were more general but no less chilling in their promise of violent consequences for my betrayal of Islam. Rashid, who had encouraged my hatred and helped plan my attack on the church, left the most painful message of all. His text arrived at 3 in the morning, waking me from restless sleep in the small flat I had rented after leaving my family home. The words were brief, but cut deeper than any elaborate threat could have. You are dead to us. We will remember your betrayal forever. I lost my earthly family, but gained an eternal one, a truth that sustained me through the loneliest nights of my new life. as an outcast from the community that had shaped my first 24 years. The members of the Anglican Church on Maple Street welcomed me with an openness that still takes my breath away, treating me not as a curiosity or a trophy of successful evangelism, but as a brother who had simply taken longer than most to find his way home. Pastor Williams became my spiritual father and mentor in ways that went far beyond theological instruction. He spent hours with me each week, patiently answering my endless questions about Christianity, helping me navigate the complex emotions of leaving one faith for another, listening without judgment as I struggled to reconcile my new beliefs with the cultural programming of my childhood. Learning to read the same book I had once destroyed became a daily discipline that transformed my understanding of forgiveness and grace. The words that had once seemed like blasphemy now spoke to my heart with the authority of divine truth, each page offering new insights into the nature of God and the meaning of redemption. I read the Gospels with the intensity of someone discovering water after years of thirst. Daily Bible study replaced daily prayers to Mecca, a substitution that required relearning the very rhythm of my spiritual life. Instead of facing east 5 times a day and reciting memorized verses in Arabic, I now spent my mornings and evenings in conversation with Jesus, speaking English prayers that came from my heart rather than my memory. The change felt foreign for months, like learning to write with my non-dominant hand. The small flat I rented above a bakery near the church became my monastery, a place where I could study and pray, and slowly rebuild my sense of identity around my new faith. The smell of fresh bread that drifted up through the floorboards each morning reminded me of Jesus' teaching about being the bread of life, creating an unexpected but comforting connection between my daily existence and my spiritual journey. Sunday mornings at the church, where I had once committed such hatred, became the highlight of my week. Opportunities to worship alongside people who had every reason to reject me, but chose instead to embrace me as family. Sitting in the same pew where Pastor Williams had first brought me after my breakdown, I could hardly believe that the angry young man who had spat on Bibles was the same person now singing hymns and receiving communion. So I'm asking you, just as someone who has lived on both sides of this divide, just as someone who has experienced the darkness of religious hatred and the light of divine love, what will it take for you to examine your own heart? What will it take for you to set aside the prejudices and assumptions that keep you from experiencing the transformative power of God's grace? The hatred I carried for so long was not really about Christianity or any other religion, but about the fear and insecurity and spiritual emptiness that I tried to fill with anger and self-righteousness. When Jesus reached down and paralyzed my arm that November morning, he was not punishing me for my attack on his followers, but offering me a way out of the prison I had built for myself with years of cultivated rage. Don't wait for a supernatural sign like I received, because most people will never experience such dramatic divine intervention. Don't wait until you're on your knees with a paralyzed arm to listen to the voice that is calling your name right now, in this very moment, inviting you to step out of whatever darkness has been holding you captive and into the light of authentic spiritual freedom. Jesus didn't see my hatred when he looked at me that morning. He saw my potential. He didn't see my past, when he chose to intervene in my life so dramatically. He saw my future. He doesn't see your mistakes or failures or the ways you have fallen short of his ideal. He sees the person you could become if you allow his love to transform you from the inside out. If my story has touched your heart today, if something in my testimony has awakened a hunger for the kind of spiritual transformation that can only come through divine grace, then I invite you to pray with me right now. Don't wait for a more convenient time or a better understanding of theology or a more dramatic sign than the one you're receiving right now through these words. I am Fawad, once an enemy of the cross, now a soldier for Christ, and I stand before you as living proof that no one is beyond the reach of God's transformative love. No matter what you have done or failed to do, no matter how far you have wandered from the path of righteousness, Jesus is calling your name and inviting you to experience the same miracle of grace that turned my life completely around that November morning outside a small British church.